Today, we're going to look at doing our 6.6 by hand exercise. Now, I want you doing this using quadratic formula, not factoring. I know in 6.6 we have been factoring, but in Chapter 11, they want us to use the quadratic formula. What I have found is over time, my students have better luck with the quadratic formula if they've had a little bit of practice with it before we get to Chapter 11 and the answers get ugly. As you remember, a quadratic equation looks like x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The quadratic formula says when I've got a quadratic in this form, which is standard form, I can find x by simply doing the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now I put a parenthesis around this b squared to remind you that even if you had a negative, it's negative times negative. This number, once squared, will always be positive. Your 4ac sometimes is negative, sometimes is positive once you get the multiplication done. But the b squared is always positive. Now, let's look at a problem. Before we start, I want to go ahead and put the quadratic equation back at the top of my page. And I do this every time I work one of these problems so that I can memorize that quadratic formula. So it's the opposite of b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And the problem I want to look at to begin with is x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 0. In this case, my a is 1. There is a number missing in front of the x squared. When I don't have a number here, I assume it to be 1. My b is negative 6, and my c is 9. Now it's time to just put these numbers into the quadratic equation and come up with an answer for my x value. The opposite of negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9 all over 2 times 1. So I get positive 6, that's the opposite of negative 6, plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 36 over 2. So I get 6 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2. Oops. Well, let's see if I can get back to the problem. That gives me x equals 6 plus or minus 0 over 2. X equals 6 plus 0, which is 6, over 2, which is 3, and x equals 6 minus 0 over 2, which is 6 over 2, which is 3. The one and only answer for this equation, although I found 2, remember it's quadratic, and therefore I am expecting 2 answers. And there they are, both of them, but they're both a 3. Now, let's look at another problem. I have x squared equal 3x minus 2. Before I start working on this problem, what was the quadratic equation again? X equal the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The problem with this particular equation is it is not set equal to 0, therefore I cannot solve it. So what I'm going to do is subtract the 3x from both sides, add the 2, and I get x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals 0. My a again is 1, my b is negative 3, my c is 2. Now I need to put those into the quadratic equation. So the opposite of negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2 all over 2 times 1. That gives me x equal positive 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 minus 8 over 2, which gives me x equal 3 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 2, x equal 3 plus or minus 1 over 2, which gives me x equal 3 plus 1 over 2, which is 4 over 2, and that gives me 2. Right here I get x equal 3 minus 1 over 2. That gives me 2 over 2, which gives me an answer of 1. There's my 2 answers that I have for this quadratic. One last equation. Let's put our quadratic formula right back up here. X equal the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now the last equation is 16x cubed minus 12 x squared minus 18x equals 0. Now the problem with this guy is he's not a quadratic equation. He's a cubic equation. Notice the power of 3. I've got to make this thing a quadratic equation before I can solve it. Now, in the first section of this chapter, we learned to look at these things and factor out the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor in this problem is 2x. So I get 8x squared minus 6x minus 9 equals 0. I set my first factor equal to 0 and solve. We've done this 100 times. So x could be 0. Now the other two answers, it's a power of 3, so I'm going to get 3 answers. The other two answers are going to come from that 8x squared minus 6x minus 9. In this case, a is 8, b is negative 6, c is negative 9. So I have the opposite of negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared minus 4 times 8 times negative 9 all over 2 times 8. Now when I do this, I get positive 6 plus or minus the square root of 36, and I've got two negatives in this quadratic, negative 4 and negative 9. When I multiply all of that together, I get positive 288 over 16. Continuing to do the math, I get 6 plus or minus the square root of 324 over 16. Taking the square root of 324, I get 6 plus or minus 18 over 16. So I get x equal 6 plus 18 over 16 and 6 minus 18 over 16. 6 plus 18 gives me 24 over 16, and I must reduce all my fractions since a 4 will divide, an 8 will divide out of both of those. When I divide out an 8, I get 3 halves. And here I have negative 12 over 16, and a 4 will divide out of both of those to give me negative 3/4. Now, please remember you had a cubic when you started. You need 3 answers. Therefore, you need to bring this x equals 0 down the page and include him in your answers. Don't lose him. It was cubic. You're expecting 3 answers. Make sure you have all 3. All right. With that, I think you're ready to start the assignment. Page 461. I need you to do problem number 24, 28, 32, 40, 47, and 48. I need you doing this using the quadratic formula, not factoring. All of these will factor, yes, because all of them have nice answers. I want you practicing the quadratic formula, so this must be turned in using the quadratic formula. If you factor, I'm going to not grade it. All right. Thank you.